You mentioned that 30-something was a show where the main theme was not incorporated into the body of the show itself.
Right.
But that seems atypical. It seems like a lot of shows, the theme is worked into the show itself. What was your process? Was that more often than not the case, that that you work a theme into the show itself?
Well, with 30-something, it just didn't ever really seem to fit. It never kind of came up. Certainly with other shows, it did. But with that show, I don't know, the theme really seemed to stand apart and to be not about the characters as much as it was about an overview of the whole thing. It's about, it was more like, hurry up, come to the TV, we're going to start. It was like the Andy Griffith theme when I used to hear the whistling. It was like, oh, quick, sit down in front of the television, Andy's coming, Yeah,
that's a good point, actually. Well, so the practice of using the theme for other shows is much more of a common thing. Is that right?
Well, I think it's, I've had all different versions of it where, I would use, did a show called Early Edition that it had a very specific fabric for the main title, and I would use different versions of that interspersed in the show from time to time. West Wing became one of those ones where the theme, we used it very sparsely and only for certain moments in the show, but it would have a great impact when we did use it. And because we didn't use it all the time, we didn't use it for interstitial music. We didn't use it for just a traveling cue from one place to the other. Anytime we used it, it was for significant emotional impact, and didn't get used more than a couple of times a year.
As a series progressed, let's say it's been on for 2 or 3 years and it's still going and you're still composing for it, would you ever use, was there ever sort of a pat library of the studio had, like needle drop or anything, or did you build a series of cues that you could reuse, or was it always like brand new?
No, it's not always brand new. What I did is rarely, after a few years, you do build up a library of cues, and what I have always tried to do is I immediately when I finish scoring an episode, I feed the episode back to the editors so that when they're tracking the show with the directors or with the producers to make it flow to give it to the network, that they're using me instead of John Williams or something else, that they're using the fabric of the show inside the body of the show. So from time to time, there'll be certain themes that just really work great behind certain kinds of scenes. So you end up with and that's why, and I mentioned it earlier, that's why an episodic series gets easier in some ways, because you do have your bag of thematic material or stylistic material, whether it's just open piano or if it's a certain kind of a sound or if it's a certain actual theme that you can put on different instruments. I would always rewrite it to fit the picture. The only time those pieces get tracked or when one of two things happens. Either they get to the dub and they don't care for the cue as much as the cue they had dropped in tracking it when they tracked it, or there are times when you just don't have the time to write 25 minutes of music, and then I'll have a music editor cut in 2, 5, 6 cues, whatever is necessary, whatever is going to work for that episode. We've compressed this time schedule down to, I was reaching a point with West Wing where I had 24 hours from spot to dub. It was just at times insane. And most of the time that wasn't tracked because I learned how to do the music as thematically really quickly. But those are the 2 times you use track stuff. I don't like to just drop cues in all the time because they stop breathing with the film. And yet sometimes a cue drops in and it works perfectly. And so you'll start from that idea and then make it work to the film better.
So just to be clear on this, an editor, if they needed to put in basically some temp music, could use music from your bag of music.
Absolutely, because I feed it to them.
Okay.
I feed it to them until I go ahead and score it. And then it gives me a little bit of feedback on what they're looking like, what they're looking for the moment. I mean, if a producer goes, well, I like the way it starts, but I hate where it goes, then at least you get an idea of kind of what he's sensing, and you don't have to pick their brains too much.
When you write music, do you ever do research about the music, or do you just use what your kind of lifelong body of knowledge of music to?
No, you research. I mean, when Bennett and I did Winnie, even earlier back then, we got real involved, went to UCLA and went to the music department and looked at all their instruments and all the weird instruments they had. And if you're researching in a certain style, if somebody's, I'll try to tell a director or a producer when I'm working with them, just give me bits and pieces of what you think about when you listen. What were you listening to when you wrote it? Or what were you thinking about? Or who's your favorite artist? And I try to get those bits and pieces. And if they're not familiar to me, I'll do some research on them and then do a quick study and then throw it away and then start. And my agent used to say to me, it sounded like you. And of course, I can't hear that. But it's probably because of the interpretation of, although I've tried to immerse myself in a bunch of different styles, I always kind of come back to a certain simple melodic, emotional thing. So I think you do the study and you immerse, but I'm not a school musician, so I wouldn't be the guy to sit down and do a 30s score based on what 30s orchestras were doing. I probably wouldn't be the right guy for that.
Where do you physically create the music? I mean, do you sit in front of like this console with a guitar and look at a picture, or where do you actually write?
Well, I have a studio that's duplicated here at my home. So the whole writing console where I work is identical to here, so that we can just send files back and forth on the internet. And so when I'm working on something at home, I can send it right down here and they can bring it up and it sounds the same as it sounds at my place, in theory. It's always in theory with computers, but that's where I'm able to just be free enough to make every mistake you can make and not have, it's hard enough not judging myself, much less having somebody else in the room. I've gotten a little bit better at that, but it's kind of a lone procedure, and it's good to do it at home. When I first moved from this house where this studio was, I was writing down here, and that first Christmas, my son came home with a family portrait and put it on the refrigerator, and there was 3 people in it. And I said, "Well, who's this?" He said, "Well, that's Mommy, and that's Connor, and that's me." I said, "Well, where's Daddy?" He said, "Oh, Daddy's at the studio." And it was like slap in the face that I was going to be that father who was never home. So I built a studio at my home, and so I always write at home and come down here to do the actual recording work.
So, I mean, the way the technology is today, we have an audio board that has, 48 or whatever. It seems like an endless number of like knobs and pots and all that. Are you physically doing that part of it too, or do you like an engineer in who does that?
I have an engineer. I have people who, for years we've had to translate whatever I created, because I can't write music. It's had to be translated to the page. So I've always had assistants, orchestrators, guys who work with me, guys who generally start out as assistants to me and orchestrate, and then they generally end up writing shows with me, and then they get to screen credit, and then they move on with their own careers. That's not something that is organic to me, and so it's not something I do. I don't trust my ears on this level. And when you're doing multiple series, I spend so much time writing that if I had to have the other job, I'd never get them done. We had at one point 10 series 1 year being produced out of this room. And I was doing nothing but chained to a computer. I was just writing all the time.
When you look at a piece of video, how do you know whether it needs music in a certain part, or it's a part that, how do you decide where the music goes?
Know or decide is two different things. How do I know? I know when it feels right. I decide when it fits the shape, or when I'm told to decide for it to start there. I mean, there again, it's a collaborative art. I'm trying to, at best, put my art on top of yours, and yours takes precedence. So, that's elusive. That's, you have to talk to producers, directors, whoever the creative focal point is. Sometimes it's a team, but usually it's one person. You have to get inside their mind and find out what it is they're thinking. It's so subjective, you know, where I might start a cue might be right for me, but it's not giving the intended shape of what the writer, creator, director thought. And sometimes with writers and directors, you're scoring to the thing they wrote, not the thing you've got. Because the film is not necessarily what they shot on the page. And sometimes they're so locked into the page that they're trying to, you know, force that square peg into the round hole. And sometimes you do it, and sometimes you do it under protest. But generally, you know, if it's wrong, and people see that it's wrong.
Does the collaboration extend to the network? I mean, do you get notes directly from the network, or is it all kind of, you know, is it filtered?
How soon is this coming out?
Is it filtered through the producers of the show?
It usually filters through the producers. More and more I find myself on conference calls with network and studio, which there's no business for a composer being on a call with the network and the studio, because you get so many voices. You know, I think that's one of the things that's happening to the creative process now is the artists, who are the writers, the directors, the creators of the show, get so watered down with notes that you get pablum. I mean, I'd rather have something strong, distinctive that people just don't like than something that, you know, let's cross all these barriers and maybe we'll get to this. The really strong guys that I've worked with, the guys who have a real great point of view and are really going for something, basically take the notes and don't even look at them. And occasionally they'll look at them and call back and say, I'm not going to do that. But the strongest executive producers and creators, they have a point of view, and those are the people that it's a pleasure to work hard for. It's the ones who don't know. Maybe I'll know it when I hear it. That's hard because you're shooting at a moving target.
How often do you work with a lyricist?
Virtually never. Although I'd like to do that more. I'm not a songwriter. I was always a lousy lyricist.
Do you have proteges that you work with?
Not proteges. I all along have had people I've worked with, whether it was, you know, like Bennett has Bennett Salve's been a reoccurring collaborator with me. Besides that, I've always had younger guys coming in who are breaking into the business, who, if they have a musical and a film sense, end up staying for a while. And I do my best to show them what I do and let them watch. And there again, it's totally subjective. What I might write and what they might write might both work, but one's my point of view. And so all I can share is my experience and what I think are my strengths. So I try to share that with the guys that work with me. And I really believe that to just get a room full of kids in the back room writing is not the way I wanted to run my career. So generally I have one person who works with me, and I'm probably on my third or fourth one, who've kind of come up and they start as an assistant and then they orchestrate and then they start writing, and if they are good with film, then they stay writing and then they get screen credit and they get cue sheet credit, and then at a time when the time is right, they move on and launch their own career, and I start with somebody else. So protege in that aspect, yes. You know, I think I've been given so much in this that I owe back, and it's part of the repayment to try to pass on what I've learned, and there again, you know, take what works for you and then throw the rest away.
Do you ever go to the set?
Rarely. And I don't go to dubs either. And kind of for the same reason. I don't go to the sets because I'm usually really busy. And the set is a pretty tedious place. Unless they're doing a musical sequence or there's a reason for me to be there, I don't go out and hang out at the set. If I'm at a spot, I'll go down and say hi. But, you know, these are people that I spend, you know, 10 hours a day with who've never seen me. So I have a relationship with the actors, but they've never seen me, so they don't know me from Adam. And the set's not as fascinating a place to me as what I get to do.
When you're doing like an orchestration, like something you might have done on West Wing, and you have like a full orchestra, where do you physically record that?
Well, West Wing was recorded at the Warner Brothers Studios. I think we did I'll Fly Away at Fox. Kind of moved all around. Used to use a couple of different places in Burbank, Evergreen for Sisters. I can't remember the name of the place that we used for some movies, The Stand, and some other stuff. You know, just it depends on the size of the room and the nature of the score. I don't do, for the most part, 100-piece orchestral score, so I don't go to a Fox stage or those things. Because the dominant part of my work is television episodic.
Let's talk about some of your other projects. In 1994, there was a television movie called Rise and Walk, the Dennis Byrd Story.
Mm-hmm.
What was your musical approach to that?
Wow, I don't remember. I can tell you the players. Michael Dinner was the director, and Peter Berg was starring as Dennis Byrd, who Peter Berg I now work with on Friday Night Lights. Michael Dinner I've worked with since the second year of Wonder Years. And I don't honestly remember the score that I did. I know Michael was happy with it, but I don't really remember the score per se. It was probably pretty organic, but we had football sequences that I remember were dramatic and maybe a bit orchestral. But
Well, the movie was, well, there was...
it was small ensemble, I'm sure.
Inspirational, I guess, would be a theme. Does that...
Yeah, because the nature of his story, but... You know, so hopefully a lot of the things that I do get to be inspirational in nature. When you're doing character-driven drama, hopefully you're heading toward a higher plane. Anyway, so I guess inspirational. I really don't remember the score, to be honest with you.
Also in '94, you did a miniseries, Stephen King's The Stand. How did that come about?
I remember every note of that. I knew that project was coming up, and I kind of talked to my agents and had them contact the people, and I kind of got word that that the director had a guy he used all the time, and it wasn't going to work out. And as it turned out, Stephen King was my favorite author, and still is. Read everything he's ever written, and The Stand was my favorite book. I read it about the time I got sober, and had read 2 other versions of it, and as it turned out, Stephen had seen some late night movie of the week I had done, a Western, and he went to Mick Garris, who was and said he'd like to get in touch with me, and because he said he wanted Blue Jeans music. And so my contact was kind of with Stephen and Mick, and when they called, I was just absolutely thrilled. And it was an 8-hour miniseries that had 6 hours of film and a little over 4 hours of music. And for me, it was really fun because it started as a slide guitar score, and slowly, because it's very much a spiritual story of good against evil, went from a small guitar score all the way up to a full orchestral score. And I got over the scope of doing that 4 hours of music and that 6 hours of film, got to really build on themes and take them from simple guitar themes into full orchestral themes. And it was one of the most difficult, grueling things because we had no time, and it was dubbing in New York, and we were sending. I remember the last night we were here doing the last cues, and they were, in New York, ready to dub that day and waiting for the final cues as I was doing them. But it was wonderful. It was wonderful to work with Steve. And I remember at one point we were short on money. There was the budget. We just didn't have enough budget, and Steven sent me a personal check so we could do what I wanted to do on the budget. I mean, out of his personal account. And it's rare you find people who are committed like that.
So he had direct input.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, once I started working on it, Steve's real busy and he was doing other things, but we had conversations back and forth once a week or so, and he didn't actually come to the studio because he was always back east, but he got copies of what I was doing and knew what I was doing, and then he wrote the liner notes on the CD we released on it.
Was he really the final say musically?
Absolutely. Creatively, he's the reason I was there. I think Mick just had to put up with me. But in the end, it turned out to be a good collaboration.
What kind of suggestions did he have, or musical ideas, in terms of, you might think, well, there might be a conventional approach to this, and then something that's not what might be the obvious type
Well,
of music,
the
what's
conventional
ominous or scary or something like that.
The conventional approach was the orchestral horror movie. Stephen told me flat out, he said, what I want is blue jeans music. He wanted, and the score he had heard before had, slide guitar and dobros and, that kind of rootsy country thing. It was a Western. And that's really what he wanted. And so I tried to stay true to that. And also Mick Garris was an orchestral fan. And also because the scope of the story grew and grew. So Steve put up with the orchestral stuff toward the end as long as it was interspersed with what he was really looking for, which was just basic spiritual. Steve's a guitar player. I don't know if you know that, but because he's a guitar player, he's a guitar fan. So the score was predominantly guitar and built into orchestral.
When he came up with that blue jeans music approach, was that exciting for you? I mean, the fact that he didn't say, let's just have the typical scary blah 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 type thing. I mean, was that a good moment for you?
Yeah, it was great because I knew I was at least in a certain realm that I knew he was already happy in, but that I would get to. I'd never done I'd never done a horror picture or anything, supernatural in nature. So for me, it was a real challenge, and it's always equally exciting and equally scary. Exciting when you get it, scary when you start doing it.
When it came out it came out commercially, right? The score did, and you said you wrote 4 hours of music total. How much of that music actually made it into what was available?
About 70 minutes, I think, 60, maybe 60 or 70, whatever we could fit on a CD. We had a budget because we could only do so much orchestral because you have to pay for that. So it was maybe the final record was about 25% orchestral and 75% roots.
Was that pulled together from the original recording?
From the original score.
So it wasn't re-recorded or?
No.
Okay.
I pulled it together and I pieced it together and recorded some pieces to make it work, but to make it flow as its own piece. But
cool.
That was really fun.
The same year you did My So-Called Life. And that was another Ed Zwick and Marshall Herskovitz show.
Wonderful show. It's one of those other great shows that I've had the opportunity to do. We only did 19 of them, and it was a precursor to all the kids' shows, and it, once again, kind of had its own sound. Once again, it was Ed and Marshall, and Scott Wynant and Winnie Holtzman created the show, and with remarkable characters, and Claire Danes was kind of her breakout role. A wonderful show, wonderful show. And that, I worked very closely with Scott on the sound of that show. Scott's very much a music buff. And he gave him, he was the first guy who gave me some film on 30-something. So, working with him was always a pleasure.
Describe the musical theme of that show.
The main title was taken from the opening piece of the pilot, the feel of it. But really, I always kind of saw it as kind of a rock band collage of intros. I had a voice in there, a fellow named Julian Raymond, who's a great producer now, produces bands, and I had Julian sing on it. I had rock guitars, I had acoustic guitars. I approached it as much as I could from a really youthful point of view, and once again, the main title kind of evolved. It was one of those fun things where we were sending film back and forth between me and the editor creating the main title, so it was morphing all the way through the main title. It was really a fun piece. It was rhythmically driven, acoustic electric guitars, marimbas, percussion drums, ouds, udus, all kinds of weird things.
You started working on sitcoms too in the 90s. How did working on that genre differ from dramas for you? I mean, how is the music different?
Well, sitcoms for the most part are about transition. It's about pacing and transition, and I used to, jokingly call it commerce. I had a lot of friends who did them and who made tons of money doing them. I actually got involved in doing them because of a relationship that I had with Tom and Roseanne, Tom Arnold and Roseanne Barr. Tom and I were friends, and they were going to do this new kind of show and they wanted heavy metal music, so they called me, and it was a show called the Jackie Thomas Show, and I did that one show for him, and it was fun for me because it was electric guitar, and that kind of started this string of them, because I really wasn't particularly interested in half hour. It was a real lick stealer too. Trying to write 25 little 5-second cues was really, to me, not as much fun or as emotional. But I started with that, and then Tom and Roseanne asked me to take over Roseanne for them, and then that all of a sudden this kind of flurry of them happened, and I began to work on some other shows. Roseanne it was really fun working on that show. I had a great time, but Roseanne was a piece of work, and in the middle of all that, of course, Roseanne and Tom broke up, so I got to be in the middle of that. That was fun.
When you approach a sitcom, you mentioned sort of transitional elements, or seem to be the thing that drives it. Would you say that's the main? Is that the main part that music has to play in a sitcom? Is sort of transitions? It's
changing now because it used to be dominant with laugh tracks. Now with a half-hour television show, it's generally half-hour single camera most of the time, and they're doing those where they don't use laugh tracks, so music takes over the role the laugh track used to take over. But in the beginning, it was transitional to get you out of one scene into a new environment with a time change, to keep the pacing going, to keep the flow moving. So they were generally shorter cues. Roseanne, we had some emotional stuff. Jackie Thomas, it was always just trying to be jarring, jarring from one moment to the next, because it was anti-TV at the time, kind of heavy metal. So nobody was doing heavy metal sitcoms at the time. So.
Well, are sitcoms, would you say, conducive to kind of building a library of cues?
Absolutely.
And how did that work?
Well, later on, with Roseanne and Jackie Thomas, I scored every episode. But later on with shows, I would build a library of. I would score the first few or the first year, and then build a library of cues that covered. Might be 100 cues in a library, and then a couple of times a year I'd go back in and fill those out with other things we needed. And then when the shows needed a specific moment of scoring, you go in and you score that for them. But for the most part, the library got laid in at the last minute. Half hours, or much shorter schedule, and they really didn't need the week-to-week attention. I find, even with Drew Carey, once we got a sound for the show, we stayed with that show, except for specific episodes which had to be scored. You might have an alien episode or, a love story episode. But most of the time, that was kind of rock accordion and rock guitar. So,
did you get assignments where someone would say, "Hey, can you write me a theme for a sitcom?" And that's it. We just want you to write the theme, and then walk away.
No.
Or was it always part of the fabric of the show?
I did a couple of those for dramas. And neither one of them were shows that got picked up. But for me, the theme usually comes organically out of scoring the material, scoring these characters. A perfect example of that is the West Wing theme. We were trying to write, I was working on 3 different themes for West Wing when we first started, when we did the pilot and we're getting into the first episodes. And they were tipping with John Williams, and Aaron kind of wanted a pop song, a big Susu Studio kind of pop song. And in the end, we were scoring the third episode with an orchestra. And Tommy Schlamme came over to my house, and I played him a sketch for the end cue of the third episode. And Tommy said, "That's it." I said, "That's what?" He said, "That's our theme." I said, "Really? Huh?" He said, "That's our theme." And it was this simple little piano thing that I had written that was really a gospel piece that played on a scene where the president was giving his first television broadcast from the Oval Office, and it was a big scene where they pan back. And so the first 3 episodes went on the air with synth versions of that until I could actually get it written for picture and orchestrated. And then we did the orchestral piece. And it came just from a moment in the show, from a spiritual moment in the show. So
When
the best ones come from the fabric of the characters, and those are the ones that seem to be really true to what the show is and have the longevity.
When they reissued those for DVDs and for reruns, did they go in and put in your orchestral version of those episodes?
I'm not sure.
I heard that they did. But
you heard they did?
Yeah.
They probably did. The synth version we did here on a Sunday for, I don't know, we had a Wednesday air or something, so we had to get it to drop into all the shows real fast. The synth version didn't make it long. It only, I think, aired on the second episode.
I want to come back to West Wing, but
Okay.
just to finish off sitcoms, let's do a real quick kind of word association. I'm
Okay.
going to name a few sitcoms and tell me what was the for you, the musically, kind of what sticks in your mind about each one.
Okay.
I think you already mentioned Jackie Thomas, kind of the heavy metal approach. Ellen, which started as These Friends of Mine.
Well, that originally started, I used a good friend of mine on fretless bass, and These Friends of Mine morphed into Ellen, but it was kind of really fun, and fretless bass was the primary instrument in it. It changed over time and kind of moved more to a guitar show, but originally it was fretless bass and drums, and a lot of fun.
Okay. Tom, 1994.
Tom, that was Heartland, you know. It was mandolins and acoustic guitars and some slide guitar, and but Heartland music, not country, but probably more similar in a funny way to the stuff I was doing on the stand, although not serious at all. But the heart of America, you know, blue jeans music, if you like, from Stevens Word.
And then mid-90s, Roseanne.
Roseanne was really just blues harmonica, and when I came and took over the show, I took it a little bit more into a guitar realm because I was still performing all the guitar. It was sax and harmonica blues, really.
The Drew Carey Show.
First time, and I'd worked with an accordion since 30-something, but it was something it was kind of a cross between polkas and rock and roll. They had originally had a theme called Moon Over Parma, and Parma, in that part of Cleveland, there was a lot of polka music, so they used accordion. So I just combined, you know, rock and roll guitars and a great accordion player named Frank Morocco.
It seemed like the theme changed every year, like there was a new...
Yeah, they changed all the time, but I never wrote any of the themes for that show.
And then the Norm Show.
The Norm came from the same association. It was the same folks who were doing Drew, and that one changed about 5 times. That one we did sample vocals on for a while, and we did drums on for a while, and that show never was able to find a specific voice. We were always changing, trying to find a voice for that show, and it never locked down, for the producers anyway.
In 1998, you started writing music for a show called Sports Night, and you became associated with Aaron Sorkin. How did that happen? Tell us that story.
I got a call from my agents. I was up in Mammoth, and I was skiing with my family. I got a call from my agents, and they said, there's this guy who's got he's doing a half-hour television show, and you know, he did A Few Good Men, and he's a screenwriter, but he really likes 30-something, and he wanted to see if you'd be interested. So I talked to him on the phone and had a great conversation with him, and I said, yeah, send me the script. So he overnighted me the script, and I got the script, and I started reading it, and I realized, well, this thing's 62 pages long. Someone misspoke, because a half-hour sitcom is 30 pages. Turns out it was a half hour, but it was Aaron Sorkin writing a half hour, which was a 60-page script. And the minute I read it, I just fell in love with it, and called him immediately and said, I'd love to do this. And kind of ended up coming up with that was one of the scores that I played everything on and played slide guitar on, and hadn't had a chance to do something like that, which was a half hour, but still very much dramatic in nature. And that was the precursor, that started the relationship with Aaron and Tommy that I kept up for a couple other series.
Now, as you approach the theme for that show, Aaron Sorkin's a very hands-on guy in terms of how he feels about things. What was that process like? In that he knew your work from, from afar, he knew your work and respected you.
There was a lot of cooks in that one. And as it has been the case each time I've worked with Aaron, there've been a lot of ideas. He's really, he's got tons of ideas. Tommy Schlamme, who's worked on all the 3 series that we've done together, has tons of ideas, and a lot of times it's just firing emotions and firing little things off, and I had to kind of put it together. At one point, there was so much talk of, well, we have a show, but it's a show inside a show, and then there's the what's going on inside the show, so it got kind of all over the place. Where we started to go with the main title with that was like action sports music. And in the end, we didn't really end up with a particular main title sequence for that show. It was always just a card, and I used this, I had a style of in some ways, kind of 30-something-ish that I played on electric guitar that was just real energetic and fun and had a wry context to it. And yet we never had a main title sequence, where we had the characters and all that stuff. Generally, it would just start with a card. And also we were fighting the laugh track thing with ABC at that time. So that was a fascinating process. The very next year, we compounded another show on top of that. And that's when it really got wild, when we were doing Sports Night and West Wing. And, I just kind of played what came natural. I mean, I remember there was some talk at one point about Little Feat. I think that was one of the names that was tossed around in terms of style. So I enjoyed playing it. I couldn't tell you what style it is. I mean, most of the stuff I couldn't tell you what style it is.
When you read those script pages for Sports Night, and then at some point, I assume you saw some footage. Did your thinking musically change from what you were reading to what you were seeing?
Well, it was so, they're such filmmakers that I never dreamed we would have like the opening sequence. The opening sequence for Sports Night and the pilot was a really long sequence, and I never dreamed we'd have that much music, and I never dreamed it would be that they did even a half hour like a movie. I mean, everything was so beautifully shot and well done, and they had really specific ideas. I was very surprised once we got into it how much music it had, but pleased too, because it was great drama and comedy with both. We rarely played the comedy. The comedy always stood on its own.
When you accomplished that first piece of music for Sports Night, what was Aaron Sorkin's reaction, and what was your anticipation of that? Were you nervous or?
Always nervous. Always nervous. Aaron's one of those great people to work with where when he responds to a piece of music, he responds emotionally. The biggest compliment he ever paid me was when I saw him tear up a little bit at one of my cues. Aaron was just always excited about it. And if it was wrong, you knew it immediately. So, and there's always that process. I mean, they gave me the opportunity. They would actually come here to the studio when I was creating it. And they really gave me the freedom. And I asked him, I said, give me the freedom to fail, absolutely. If you want me to really be able to create for you, then you've got to let me absolutely fail. And they did. And they had a sense of humor about it, and they were completely non-judgmental. And that's probably one of the best things about working with really great filmmakers is that they understand that process.
Now, Sports Night started out for the first maybe half a season with an audience and a laugh track, or at least I know there's a big battle you mentioned with ABC. Mm-hmm. But the way the show was shot, it often had, single camera winding through halls and everything like that, steady cam, and they were actually famous for, maybe doing 3 scenes in front of the audience, and then the actors would sit on stools and read the scenes so the audience could see it.
Yeah.
So in terms of the musical approach, when they finally got rid of the audience mid-season, first season, did the musical approach change in terms of what you had to do and the challenges you had to fill what they didn't want to begin with, which was laugh tracks and?
Well, Not really, because the laugh track never worked. I mean, that was the odd thing about it. The way Aaron wrote, you know, I encroached over the laugh track more than I would on any other sitcom, because on other sitcoms, you know, the laugh track plays the joke, and then music would come out as that starts to go down and propel you. They didn't want the laugh track in there in the first place. So I was stepping all over it, walking all over it, which I was not normally trained to do. But in this case, you know, it wasn't that kind of show. It just wasn't that kind of show. So did my job get harder? I think my job got easier, because once we got the laugh track out of it, it was more what they envisioned. And it was easier to work to, rather than having to work around some bull somebody had dropped in the middle of the living room, you know.
So you were real busy around in the late 90s, it sounds like, with doing Sports Night. Then Providence came along, too.
Right.
What was your involvement with that?
Providence was one of the people, Monica Wyatt, who I had been working with on a show called Relativity before that, Monica actually worked with me also on My So-Called Life. She was doing the show, and they came to me and they wanted me to do it, and so I did the pilot for them, and it was kind of a chick show, as I said, and it was going to be a mid-season, and we were really having trouble finding the style, and I remember it was problematic. Plus, I was really busy, and so Bennett came in for the second show, and we did a couple of shows, and we just had a hard time. We had 3 or 4 executive producers, and we were just having a hard time making it gel. And I remember, probably the week before it aired in January, I remember Ben and I were talking, and going, maybe this is just not, we just shouldn't do this. You know, maybe this is just too much work. And I remember I got the overnights on Saturday morning, because it aired on Friday night, and I called Bennett up and I said, you might want to rethink this, because it had just hit the numbers really hard. And Bennett stayed with me on it, and I would write and work with him, and toward the end, Bennett really took the lion's share of all the work. It was a very organic show, but we got to go back to some of the things we had done before, that Bennett and I had worked on before, using a string quartet. We had worked with cello quartets before, but we used a string quartet and kind of used it in a Beatley fashion. I'd done that on Early Edition, but we took it to a different level. We kind of played more humor with bending whole quartets and things, and we had enough of a budget to be able to do that every week, and it was a really fun show. Difficult show, because it would go from a life and death moment right to a joke, or right from a joke to a medical emergency. So you had to kind of dance on razor blades a little bit.
You wrote the theme to that too?
No, the theme was a Beatles song.
That's right. That's right.
There are places I remember, and they had a girl singer. At one point, they asked us to kind of produce it, and I just couldn't do it. You know, I knew we had so much going on at that time to get in there and produce an artist who I didn't know. And Peter, oh gosh, I can't remember his name, English producer, worked with the Beatles and all this stuff. Anyway, he ended up producing it, the main title for that.
And also Ed Zwick and Marshall Hershkovitz came back in your life with Once and Again.
Once and Again, yeah.
So you're juggling a lot of shows. How did that happen?
Well, you know, they called. It was kind of funny. They called, and the way they called on the last couple of shows I've done with them, they called. They said, "Well, you know, I don't know if you're right for this one, but you know, we thought we'd give you a call anyway." And I invariably say, "Well, how can I help?" Because these guys really kind of opened the whole door for me, and I don't think they feel like I owe them anything, but I love their filmmaking. So we sat down and we tried to do it, and I remember at one point Ed was going, "Can't you just play left-handed or something so it doesn't sound like you?" And I was going, "You know, Ed, I'm just who I am." And we went through a whole lot of things in the beginning trying to find it. He had attempted with some stuff from, God, I can't remember the movie, the one Tom Cruise was in, where he played the agent. "Show me the money."
The sports agent.
Yeah, the sports agent. And he attempted with a lot of stuff. The director was the director's girlfriend, one of the girls from Heart. And so it was a bunch of intros is what it was. And it really kind of was Simon and Garfunkel in a way. So, you know, we struggled with that. And when we finally found it, and we beat each other up a lot, and we finally found it. And then it became, you know, once again, one of the most organized shows I've ever worked on, because those guys were always so much out ahead, and they knew what it took to get a show done. And they, you know, I could say we could set up a spot 2 months in advance, and that's when we'd spot. Nobody does that anymore.
What was the what would we come away from Once and Again musically? When you think of that show, what
You know, we were still in the acoustic guitar world. We were still in that world. We combined some other elements, but it was still pretty much me doing me. I mean, I didn't play the bluesier kind of stuff. I never touched any of that I did with 30-something with them, because that was a quick way to get in trouble. Because, you know, they knew they were going to get hit. They knew it was going to be it's 40-something. They knew. And I said to him at one point, I said, listen, you guys write the way you write. We've done My So-Called Life. We've done 30-something. You write the way you write. This is 40-something. And I can't be the one who makes it different. In the end, it was different. It was its own show. But there was a whole sensibility about it that you couldn't deny and that I couldn't get away from, that came from that foundation. So it was that in a way. The music was, if you put those two scores together, they wouldn't be the same. But in tone and in intention, I think they were of the same world.
Because Ed and Marshall were so big on ensemble dramas with many characters, when you approached those shows, whether it was 30-something or My So-Called Life or Once and Again, did you write themes for characters?
Like Peter and the Wolf, you mean? No, not really. I've done that some. I've been more successful with themes being themes that are created as you go along, and orchestration working more for the character. I did a show this year called Lipstick Jungle, where we kicked that idea around, and we started out with, you know, one character was guitar driven and one character was piano driven and the other character was synth driven, and it's already started to kind of meld, because I think that holds for a while, but as your characters grow in scope, and the lines tend to blur somehow. But I've done it a few times. I've never found it as successful because for me it becomes a little contrived. It locks me down before I've responded to the film and the story I'm dealing with.
So as you're
just my process.
As you're multitasking all these shows and you're on Sports Night, what was the first inkling you got about The West Wing kind of brewing?
Well, I knew there was a script that was floating around, and I had talked to them about it, and I said, "Oh, I'd love to do this," you know. And I'd gotten the script, and we were talking about, "Oh, we'll do a piano score, or maybe it'll be a guitar score." And then they shot the film, and then, you know, it was obviously orchestral, and they started putting John Williams in it, and they came to me, and Tommy kind of came to me and said, "Well, listen, Snuff, you know, we thought this might be, you know, but it looks like it's going to be orchestral. Can you do that?" And I had the response that any working musician has, which is yes. And I'd never worked in that realm before. And so I just dove in. And, you know, different than what some people think. You know, people, I remember after we did it, people were going, "Oh, you know, Copeland, and oh, this, and Americana." And to me, it was gospel music. It was still the same thing. It was what I was doing with those roots in I'll Fly Away. It's what I did with the Mother Abigail stuff in The Stand. It was spiritual music. It was music about the spirit and the soul, and it was orchestrated in that other world. And that's the way I've tried to approach all these different series, is find a fabric that is of that world, and then write that simple little thing that I write in that fabric, and work inside a fabric to give a show a specific sound. And I got lucky. You know, I had great orchestrators for the first 3 episodes. We only did, I think, 7 episodes with an orchestra. And all the other 100 and some odd episodes were all me performing on synth. But once you got the flavor of the orchestra in the main title, and once you got that sense, it suspended disbelief, and you just felt it was an orchestral score. A lot of people didn't know that I wasn't doing it orchestral.
By the time the first episode aired, would you call it even a debate about the musical tone of the show before it finally hit the air?
Yeah. I remember one debate we had. Aaron and Tommy loved it the minute we found it. I remember NBC, it kind of filtered down from the network that the theme, we can't have this theme on the show because it's just too old-fashioned and nobody's going to like it. And I think they went the other way once it won so many Emmys for the show and the theme won. But I remember kind of feeling like, oh, I'm going to have to do it again after I'd finally gotten one that everybody really loved.
When you think about the president, did that enter your creative thinking in terms of how to create music that underlined that?
Certainly when they used John Williams' music behind all the scenes, they used John Williams, they used James Newton Howard. Some of it was modeled on some of James Newton Howard stuff. Certainly the orchestration, the French horns, brought the grandness to it. We were able to do a lot of things. But what happened, oddly enough, on that show is in the beginning of the show, the first 4, 5, 6 episodes, we had 20 minutes worth of music in an episode. By the time we ended and started the second year, we were down to 5, 6 minutes sometimes. Because as the characters grew, we no longer needed to reinforce them or sell them. So as the characters became larger, the music score became smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's really where I started to understand the arc, and I talked about this earlier, the arc of a series. Because not only the arc of an episode or the arc of a story, but the arc of a series, as the characters become more fleshed out and as they become more a part of your consciousness of the show, they need less support. And we went to less and less music. And when we did use music, sometimes that's when very toward the end, the last 2 or 3 years, maybe once a season we'd use a theme. And for very specific moments.
As a viewer of The West Wing, one thing I noticed, and I don't know if it was conscious or not, but it certainly was an effect, I'm sure, for me and many others, was that in the kind of prologue scene, the way it almost seemed like a seamless ending from that into the rousing theme. Was that a conscious device?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it was a conscious device.
Stirring.
Well, the concept was when the first episode that we did, when I did the main title, we were going from one cue, and it was a build. It was a climactic build, and I decided that when I built it and when I wrote the theme, that I would write the theme so that it would always be in place as a theme, but that every time we went, and rarely would we just start on the theme. Sometimes we'd start a drum roll right into the theme, but most of the time we were coming out of a really dramatic moment, which needed to be scored, and what I proposed to them is, let's always do the score so it ramps right into the theme. And which kind of, sometimes I was wishing I hadn't done that, because every week I was trying to figure out a different way to get from here to there. But it became a real signature, I think, for the show, and always became seamless into that moment where people would get to release on the expression of the theme. And I think it worked really well. And it also keeps things from being choppy, and it let the storytelling really be seamless.
The marriage of that theme to the graphics, the unfurling of the American flag and all of that, how did that concept come together? What came first? The images, the music, how did it all meld?
Well, they had the theme with those visuals. They had John Williams' Olympic theme. So the picture came first, the music came second, and we adjusted a few things over the years. But, the marriage kind of, we had the film we had, and I had the theme I had. And I'm sure they fudged it a little bit to the synth version, but all those visuals were pretty much done before Tommy said, that's it, and pointed to that end cue of the third episode.
Was there a reaction among not just Tommy, but Aaron and John Wells when it was finally all married? It was a marriage put together where that music over those graphics. I mean, was there a wow moment?
Aaron was at the session when I did that, and he teared up, and he just loved it, and I just loved that I could move him. It always was fascinating to me. John I didn't really know then, because John wasn't as involved early on as he was later. Mostly it was Tommy and Aaron.
What about the length of the theme? Was it, were there different versions of it, or was it always one length?
It's always one length. I wrote it once we figured out what the theme was. I orchestrated it to the timings that we had, and I knew it had to be within 60 seconds or 55 or whichever it was. And so I orchestrated it for that timing, and always felt to me like it was a little chopped off in the end. I could have stood a couple of more seconds of that last chord, but that's me.
How much of the series used a full orchestra? And I read that you tried to book a few sessions in a season, but not like a weekly basis, but in order to record.
Well, we had two problems. We had budgetary problems because it was expensive to take a 50-piece group in. They weren't doing that much on television, and we already had plenty of expenses in our set and the actors and stuff. So I proposed, let's bunch them. What we'll do is we'll do 3 episodes at a time. I'll score one completely. I'll score most of the second one as close as you can get it cut, and the third one we'll pick a couple of themes that we know we want to have orchestral score, and I'll write those. So that's the way I would bunch them. And I did 3 of those sessions before we completely ran out of time. And by the time we got to about episode 7 or 8, I was only getting 2 or 3 days from writing to dub, so there was just no more time. And we kept saying, oh, we'll do an orchestral session for the Christmas show, or we'll do and we just never had the time. The time was so taken up by shooting and then going back and reshooting and retelling the story, and we never got back to it.